The moment that changed everything didn't begin with malice. It began with a smirk. On a chilly Friday afternoon in downtown Chicago, the latest episode of Unfiltered with Cole and Eli was recording inside a glass-walled studio just off Michigan Avenue. The guest, Eli Ramsey, had just come off a sold-out tour across the West Coast and was riding high on a wave of social media momentum. Known for his mix of indie folk and biting sarcasm, Eli had become something of a darling among younger audiences, who liked their comedy irreverent and their commentary sharp. Halfway through the taping, the host steered the conversation toward an upcoming arts gala in Chicago, where Eli was set to perform. Cole, the co-host, leaned into the mic and asked casually, "Ever run into anyone weird backstage at those things, like politicians trying to pretend they understand art?" Eli barely missed a beat. He laughed, took a sip from his branded water bottle, and said, "Actually, yeah. Pam Bondi. She was at one of those benefit gigs a while back. Real nice lady. Looked at the cello like it was IKEA furniture." The studio erupted. Eli wasn't done. "I'm serious, man. I don't think she could tell Debussy from a charcuterie board. If you asked her to name one piano piece, she'd probably say chopsticks and call it a day." The laughter that followed was loud, immediate, and infectious. It wasn't the most brutal takedown Eli had ever delivered, but it stuck, because it was easy. Pam Bondi, former prosecutor, conservative political figure, and regular presence on cable news, had long been a lightning rod for snark and skepticism among younger, left-leaning crowds. Eli's jab felt like low-hanging fruit dressed up in humor. A few hours after the podcast dropped, the clip was already making the rounds on social network, trimmed and captioned for maximum shareability. "Eli destroys Pam Bondi with musical burn. Pam, do you even know what a piano is?" And the now infamous line, "Debussy is not a cheese." By nightfall, the soundbite had crossed 1 million views and turned into a meme looped over videos of collapsing furniture, failed talent shows, and wine moms confused at art exhibits. In Naperville, Pam Bondi sat at her kitchen counter, her phone buzzing with a message from her niece Tessa, a link to the clip and a single emoji crying laughing. Pam clicked play, watched it once, then again. Her face didn't twist. She didn't scoff or frown. Instead, she quietly exhaled, placed her tea aside, and turned her phone screen down on the counter. She didn't delete it. She didn't respond. She just let the moment sit in the air, cool, still, and unresolved. The internet, for now, was having its laugh, but something had begun to stir, not in the headlines or the comment threads, but in the quiet of a woman who knew exactly who she was, and who didn't need a microphone to remind the world. Long before Pam Bondi ever stood behind a podium or on a debate stage, she sat at a piano bench in the living room of a woman named Mrs. Eloise Donatelli. It was a modest home in Dunedin, Florida, where Thursday afternoons smelled of lemon polish and old books, and where the soft clunk of an aging Baldwin upright echoed through lace-curtained windows. Pam was only 8 when she began lessons, barely tall enough for her feet to touch the floor, but there was a quiet intensity in her even then. She wasn't drawn to flashy pieces or simple melodies. She wanted to understand how to feel a note before pressing it, how to sit with silence between chords. Mrs. Donatelli was no gentle guide. She carried a slender wooden ruler and wasn't afraid to tap the edge of the bench if Pam's back curved or her fingers drooped. "Feel the space," she'd say over and over. "Don't just press notes. Tell the truth." By age 10, Pam was in love with Chopin. At 15, she was playing full sonatas from memory. And at 16, she stood under the hot lights of the Tampa Bay Youth Music Competition, hands poised to play Clair de Lune. But midway through, something broke. Her fingers hesitated, the room stilled, and the piece, once fluid and sure, fell apart. She froze. Not in panic, but in the kind of silence that sinks deep and leaves a mark. She stood, bowed quickly, and walked off stage without finishing. She didn't cry. She folded the program into a neat square and slid it into her wallet, where it would remain for years. An unfinished story, pressed flat between ambition and memory. Life, as it often does, rushed in. Her parents' divorce, college applications, a pivot from music to criminology. She told herself she'd return to piano later, when things calmed down, when life was less urgent. But things never did calm down. There were law degrees, late nights in courtrooms, campaign trails, press cycles, and strategy sessions. Somewhere along the way, the piano was moved into the guest room and covered with a thin sheet. It sat there for years, gathering dust beneath stacked law books and framed accolades. Most people who knew Pam in her political life had no idea she had ever played music. They saw the sharp suits, the firm tone, the cable news presence. No one asked what she listened to in private, what her hands remembered in the quiet. No one, except one man. Michael Lowell was a deputy prosecutor a few years younger than Pam, assigned to a brutal case in 2007 that kept them in the office past midnight for weeks. One night, over lukewarm Thai takeout, Micah noticed a folded piece of sheet music peeking out from her briefcase. "You play?" he asked gently. Pam froze. "Used to," she replied. "What piece?" he pointed. She hesitated. "Nocturne in C-sharp minor." He blinked, impressed. "That's not beginner stuff." She nodded, then returned to her noodles. Nothing else was said. But a week later, on her birthday, he left a small envelope on her desk. Inside was a photocopied music sheet, just the first few measures of that nocturne, and a sticky note with 3 handwritten words. "Don't wait forever." 5 months later, Micah died from a brain aneurysm. No warning, no time. Pam kept the note. Never spoke of it. Never threw it away. It stayed tucked in her wallet, next to that old folded program from her teen years. She didn't talk about the piano anymore, not even to herself. But when Eli Ramsey mocked her on a podcast, the sting she felt wasn't embarrassment. It was recognition. The familiar breathless quiet that once fell over a competition stage came rushing back, not as shame, as invitation. If the first jab had been casual, the second felt calculated, though Eli Ramsey would have sworn otherwise. Just a few days after the viral podcast clip, he appeared on Soundscope, a fast-paced music commentary show based out of Seattle. The host, eager to keep the online momentum alive, brought up the now infamous Bondi moment. Eli chuckled, leaned into the mic and said, "Look, I'm not saying she's not smart, lawyer smart, sure, but creative? Come on. You can't fake art. Either you feel it or you don't. I doubt she's got a musical bone in her body." He laughed, expecting more easy approval. And some of it came, the quick retweets, the snarky memes, the chorus of followers echoing his sentiment. But this time, a few older fans shifted uncomfortably. "Is this really necessary?" one commented. "Thought we were done punching down," said another. Eli didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't care. He was focused on his upcoming performance at the Langford Arts Foundation Gala, a prestigious Chicago event celebrating music education and the arts. A good gig, fancy venue, plenty of donors, press, and chances to charm the room. His name was on the bill as a headliner. He figured any buzz, mocking or not, was still buzz. What he didn't know was that Pam Bondi had received an unexpected invitation to the same event just 2 days prior. A longtime donor to education initiatives, she was asked to attend as a guest and supporter. No speaking slot, no stage time. Just a name on a table card and a seat at dinner. Initially, she hesitated. She had kept a low profile in recent years, careful about where she showed up and what it signaled. But this wasn't political, it was for the kids, for music. And somewhere deep inside her, something had stirred awake. She accepted the invitation quietly. No announcement, no press. She wasn't coming to prove anything, not yet. But that didn't mean she wasn't thinking about it. That evening, after receiving the formal gala program in her inbox, complete with Eli Ramsey's name at the top, Pam walked into the guest room, flipped back the old sheet that had long hidden her upright piano and sat down. She pressed a single key. It was out of tune. Then another. She exhaled. The sound was rough, but something inside her recognized the feel. She stood, picked up her phone, and dialed an old number she hadn't used in years. "Harlan?" she asked when the line picked up. "You still tune pianos?" The man on the other end laughed. "For you, always?" What began as a joke on a podcast was now something else entirely. Eli had tossed a stone into a pond, expecting ripples. But something deeper was shifting beneath the surface. Pam hadn't forgotten the silence of that unfinished performance, and now, with a gala on the horizon and an old piece still waiting to be played, The silence was finally beginning to break. The first few nights were rough. Pam Bondi sat at the piano like someone reacquainting herself with an old friend she hadn't spoken to in decades, not out of bitterness, but because life had simply gotten in the way. Her fingers were stiff, her timing off, and the keys felt foreign beneath her touch. But even in that awkwardness there was something comforting. The notes, though uneven, carried memory. She started slow, mostly scales, then simple preludes. She played after dinner, alone, with the hallway lights dimmed and her dog curled up nearby, occasionally lifting its head at the sound of wrong notes. No one knew. She didn't tell her niece, didn't post any cryptic photos or videos, didn't alert the world that something was happening behind her closed doors. This wasn't about ego, it was about repair. Arlen Givens came by the next afternoon. The retired music professor shuffled into the guest room, took one look at the dusty keys, and let out a low whistle. "She's seen better days," he said, setting down his toolkit. He didn't ask many questions. He didn't need to, as he tuned the instrument key by key, string by string. Pam watched in silence, hands folded in her lap like she used to when she was 10, waiting for her lesson to start. When he finished, he pressed one chord, smiled, and said, "There she is." Pam waited until he left before sitting back down. That evening, she started practicing with intention. It didn't take long for her muscle memory to return. Her fingers remembered before her mind did, slipping naturally into arpeggios, correcting posture without thought, curving just enough to soften each note. Within a week, she was playing full pieces again. By the second week, she had narrowed her choice. She didn't want to play something flashy or grandiose. She didn't want to make a statement. She just wanted to finish what she had never been able to. Clair de Lune. The same piece she had frozen on at 16, the piece that still lived, unresolved, in some corner of her memory. It felt right, not as a comeback, but as a continuation, the performance she owed not to anyone else, but to herself. Night after night, she rehearsed, always alone, always quietly. The piece required more than technical skill, it demanded vulnerability. Clair de Lune wasn't about perfection, it was about atmosphere, mood, control through feeling. It was an emotional language Pam hadn't spoken in years, yet as she played she remembered how to say things she'd buried long ago. Each note felt like a kind of honesty, a kind of reckoning. She practiced through missed notes, through moments of frustration, through the ghosts of long-ago doubts, but she never stopped. She kept going, not with fire or fury, but with calm, deliberate resolve. By the end of the fourth week, the music no longer felt like a struggle. It felt like a return. Her hands no longer ached. Her body leaned into the rhythm the way it once had under Mrs. Donatelli's watchful eye. One night, after finishing the final passage, she let her hands rest on the keys a little longer, eyes closed, chest still. She didn't cry, she just breathed. And for the first time in decades, it felt like the part of herself that had been locked away behind headlines, sound bites, and press conferences had finally come back into the room. She wasn't preparing for a performance, she was preparing for a promise, one she'd made to herself the moment she didn't walk away from that joke, but turned back toward the piano instead. The Fairmont Hotel in downtown Chicago shimmered with elegance that evening, its grand ballroom transformed for the Langford Arts Foundation Gala. It was the kind of night that felt curated. Flawless lighting, crisp linens, an ice sculpture shaped like a treble clef, and a silent auction tucked between towers of shrimp cocktails and wine glasses balanced on polished trays. The theme, Art for the Next Generation, aimed to raise funds for underfunded music programs in public schools. Chicago's elite were out in full force: philanthropists, city council members, corporate donors, and a sprinkling of celebrities. At the front of the room sat a gleaming Steinway grand piano, positioned like an ornament, its lid closed as if waiting to be noticed. No one really expected it to be used, except maybe for a brief demonstration or background ambiance. But for one woman in the crowd, that piano was the only reason she was there. Pam Bondi arrived just after 7:15 p.m. She wore a sleek black satin dress, understated pearl earrings, and no press entourage. Her name was listed on the guest roster as simply Pamela Bondi, Donner. She greeted a few familiar faces from her legal and philanthropic circles, but didn't linger. She sipped sparkling water, stood near the edge of the ballroom, and listened politely to the opening remarks. She hadn't brought a speech. She hadn't told anyone she might take the stage. She hadn't even fully decided if she would. All she knew was that her hands were ready, and the piece she had once left unfinished was waiting. Across the room, Eli Ramsey was holding court. Dressed in a brown suede jacket and open-collared shirt, he was deep in conversation with a local journalist and a radio DJ from WBEZ. His guitar case leaned against a chair beside him. Eli was exactly where he thrived, in the middle of attention, casual yet confident. He hadn't noticed Pam until she was standing a few feet away, chatting with a retired judge from Springfield. When he did, his reaction was immediate. A grin, a step forward, and the tone of a man certain he still had the upper hand. "Well, well," he said, raising his wine glass. "The legend herself. I didn't know these kinds of events were your thing." Pam turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "They are," she said, "especially when they benefit kids." He tilted his head. "Right. Music education and all that. Say, getting any closer to telling the difference between a Steinway and a side table?" A few people nearby chuckled, though less enthusiastically than they might have a week ago. Pam didn't flinch. "Do you always talk like that at charity events?" He shrugged, unbothered. "Just keeping it light. You got a sense of humor, right?" She paused. "Sometimes." Then her eyes drifted toward the Steinway. Eli, buzzed on ego and wine, saw his moment. "Tell you what," he said, gesturing grandly. "Why not prove me wrong? Play something. Anything. Dealer's choice." The laughter died quickly. Heads turned. A photographer lowered her camera. The woman manting the silent auction paused mid-bid. Pam looked at Eli, then at the piano, and then, with a voice steady and soft, she said, "I don't play for people who want me to fail." She let the sentence hang in the air, then added, "But I will play for the kids." And with that she walked toward the stage, not with drama, not with defiance, but with purpose. The room shifted. Eli stood frozen, caught in the gravity of a moment he had accidentally created. No one was laughing now. Somewhere between her chair and that Steinway, the night took a turn. Quietly, the room was not silent yet, but it was close. Pam Bondi moved toward the stage with the composed stillness of someone who didn't need an introduction. She said nothing, made no eye contact with the press, and didn't wait for anyone's permission. She simply approached the Steinway, leaned in briefly to speak with the sound technician, and took her seat at the bench. The lid was lifted, the lights dimmed slightly, and then, without fanfare, without a single word to the audience, she placed her hands in her lap and stared down at the keys. The noise in the room fell away like sand through a sieve. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Glasses hovered in mid-air. Phones, tentatively at first, came up in people's hands but not for spectacle. Something about her presence had shifted the temperature in the room. This wasn't a rebuttal, it was a reckoning. Her fingers hovered for a second. Then, gently, like someone turning a memory into sound, Pam began to play Clair de Lune. The first notes floated like breath, soft, barely there. The melody spilled out of the piano like moonlight across dark water, delicate but sure. At first some guests thought it might be a backing track, pre-recorded maybe, too smooth, too intentional to be spontaneous. But then they saw her hands, the subtle movement of her arms, the slight sway of her upper body in rhythm with the phrasing. This wasn't a performance by someone trying to prove a point. This was someone communing with something they'd carried, quietly, for years. In the back of the room, Eli Ramsey stood stiff, his wineglass untouched, his trademark grin gone. He didn't recognize the piece at first, not by name anyway, but the emotion hit him like gravity. The sound wrapped around the room like a thread, pulling every listener into its orbit. Pam's playing was not technically flashy, but it was true. Her expression never changed. Her eyes remained closed, her face still. She didn't lean on theatrics or dramatic flourishes. She let the music speak, and it did, clearer than any soundbite or monologue could have. By the time she reached the middle passage, the one she had once frozen on as a teenager, her hands moved with complete assurance. There was no hesitation, no break, only resolve. As the piece slowed into its final aching measures, the audience didn't stir. No one whispered. Even the servers paused near the doors, holding trays of untouched drinks. The room had transformed into something sacred. She held the last chord for a moment longer than necessary. Then, without bowing, without waiting for applause, she closed the lid gently and stood. A faint nod to the technician, and she stepped down from the stage, walking back toward her seat like nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had. The silence that followed her final note was thicker than any ovation. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then slowly, from the middle of the room came the first clap, then another, and then a rising tide of applause that spread until nearly everyone was on their feet. No one was cheering for politics, they weren't clapping for defiance, they were clapping for truth, for beauty that had spoken louder than mockery ever could. Pam didn't wave, didn't smile. She sat down, lifted her glass of seltzer and sipped. The performance was over. But the echo had just begun. The applause still echoed in the marble corners of the Fairmont ballroom when Eli Ramsey finally took the stage. Gone was the easy swagger he had worn like a second skin earlier that evening. He moved slower now, his usual confidence replaced by something less polished, less performative. He adjusted the strap of his guitar, tapped the microphone, and looked out at a room that no longer seemed quite as eager to laugh. "I'm going to change the set list a bit," he said, voice quieter than usual. A few chuckles came from the crowd, polite and hesitant. He didn't smile. "Before I play," he continued, eyes scanning toward where Pam sat, composed and silent, "I need to say something. When I was younger, I used to think I could size people up quick, that I knew who had depth, who had talent, who didn't." He paused, clearing his throat. "Turns out I've been pretty arrogant." He didn't apologize directly, but he didn't have to. The shift in tone said more than 1,000 sorries ever could. His set followed, stripped down and raw, just chords, and a voice that cracked slightly at the edges. There was no looping pedal, no effects, no jokes, and when he finished, the applause he received wasn't out of courtesy, it was out of respect. Not for perfection, but for vulnerability, for growth. Pam didn't clap, she simply watched, listening the same way she had played, with full presence, no agenda. It was enough. By the next morning the internet had caught up. Clips of Pam's performance, some shaky, filmed from behind tables of half-eaten desserts and wine glasses, were spreading fast. One TikTok with the caption, "Pam Bondi just silenced a room with Debussy," passed 1 million views before noon. Twitter was a storm of hot takes, but for once it wasn't full of rage. "Didn't have Pam Bondi playing Clair de Lune on my 2025 bingo card," someone tweeted. "Say what you want about her politics. This was beautiful." Others were skeptical. "No way, she just pulled that out of nowhere. This was staged," read one post. Another scoffed. "What's next, DeSantis breakdancing at Coachella?" But those voices for once were drowned out by something quieter and more powerful. Curiosity, admiration, the slow burn of collective reconsideration. For Eli, the fallout felt different. He didn't post any follow-ups. No snarky tweets, no half-hearted clarifications. He spent the morning in his hotel room, guitar across his lap, but no melody coming, just the image of her hands on the keys, the stillness she carried, the grace with which she had let the music speak for her. She hadn't tried to win, she hadn't tried to perform, she had simply been, completely and unapologetically, herself. And that, more than any soundbite or viral moment, had pierced through his armor. For the first time in years, he felt small, in the best way, humbled. Pam, on the other hand, returned home with little fanfare. She greeted her dog, watered her plants, and made tea like nothing had happened. She declined a request from Good Morning America, passed on an invitation from NPR, and even ignored a flattering email from a major music magazine titled the secret virtuoso. She wasn't interested in being rebranded. She had said what she needed to say, and it had come out in music, not words. The performance had never been about proving someone wrong, it had been about remembering who she was, even when the world had forgotten. The aftershocks weren't seismic, they were subtle, quiet, but unmistakable. A collective pause, a shift in how people saw her, and maybe how they saw each other. Pam didn't need to speak to be heard. She had already played her truth, and the world, for once, was listening. Weeks passed, but the moment at the gala didn't fade the way viral clips usually do. Instead, it lingered, shared not with outrage, but with reverence. People weren't just reposting a surprising performance, they were carrying a feeling, a truth. One YouTube comment beneath the full video summed it up best. This wasn't a gotcha moment, it was a moment of grace in a world full of noise. Pam Bondi didn't trend because she clapped back or made a speech, she trended because she didn't. In a culture where shouting has become strategy, and mockery a form of engagement, she chose the harder route, silence, intention, and beauty, and that choice, so rare, so human, cut deeper than any retort ever could. She hadn't needed to defend herself, she had just needed to be. Back in Naperville, her life returned to its soft rhythm. No interviews, no public commentary. She tuned her piano weekly now, and every evening she played a little, sometimes just a scale, sometimes a few quiet bars of Debussy, sometimes nothing more than letting her fingers rest on the keys while the day slowed down. She wasn't preparing for another stage, she was simply home, playing for herself. The viral moment hadn't changed her, it had revealed her, both to the world and, perhaps, to herself. She knew now that what she carried didn't need an audience. It had never been about applause. It had always been about peace. One day, she received a handwritten letter, not an email or DM, a real letter stamped and postmarked from a small town in Tennessee. It was from a middle school music teacher who had shown her performance to his class. They were stunned, he wrote, not just by the music, but by what it meant. I asked them afterward what they took from it. One kid said, "She didn't yell, she just played." That's going to stick with them. It stuck with me too. Pam folded the letter slowly and placed it in the same drawer where she kept Micah Lowell's sticky note, the one that read, "Don't wait forever." She never replied. She didn't need to. Her response had already been given, in the way her hands moved across those keys, in the way she reminded people that restraint isn't weakness and that power doesn't always announce itself. As for Eli Ramsey, he kept his promise. A week later, he posted a simple photo, a dusty upright piano in a practice room, captioned "Lessons Resume Monday." He lost a few followers who called him soft, gained a few more who called him brave, but none of that mattered as much as what had shifted in him. He had learned something essential, not just about Pam, but about himself, about judgment, about grace. And maybe that's the real takeaway, that it's not just about being right or being loud or being heard. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is to listen, deeply, humbly, and then choose to become better for what we've heard. The story of Pam Bondi's quiet performance teaches a powerful lesson about humility, restraint, and the danger of assumptions. In a world addicted to snap judgments and viral takedowns, it's easy to reduce people to sound bites, forgetting that behind every public figure is a private self, complex, unseen, and often misunderstood. Pam didn't respond to mockery with outrage or defense. Instead, she responded with grace, allowing her actions and her music to speak louder than any comeback ever could. Her performance reminded us that true strength isn't about proving someone wrong with louder words, but about standing firmly in your truth without needing validation. And for those like Eli who learned this lesson the hard way, it showed that growth begins with listening. We don't grow by doubling down. We grow by being willing to see people more fully than the headlines allow. The story is a quiet rebuke to the culture of noise, that dignity, empathy, and beauty still matter. And sometimes the most profound thing a person can do is simply show up, be themselves, and let that be enough.